Paris, June 27, 1988. Thousands of people are heading home after work. Two commuter trains are about to meet in one of the busiest stations in France. But far down the tracks, a commuter train is in trouble. Its brakes, the one thing keeping dozens of tons of steel under control, have almost stopped working. The driver is fighting for control as the train begins a steep downhill run straight toward the terminal, where another train, packed with people, is standing still. In less than 1 minute, the two trains will collide in one of the deadliest accidents in French history. This is the story of 1988 Gare de Lyon train collision. The Gare de Lyon is one of the three main train stations in Paris. It sits in the city's 12th arrondissement or district, on the eastern side of the French capital. From here, trains connect Paris to cities across France and beyond, making it one of the busiest transport hubs in the country. Opened in 1894, the Gare de Lyon is a two-level terminus station, meaning trains enter on dead-end tracks and must reverse to leave. By 2021, it had 16 platforms and welcomed around 150 million passengers each year, from local Paris metro services to international TGV high-speed trains. Back in 1988, regional commuter trains used the lower level of the station. To reach it, they had to travel down a steep slope, a 4.3% grade, dropping more than 4 meters over just 100 meters of track. On the day of the crash, one of the trains was waiting at track 2 in the underground platforms. This was regional train number 153,951, scheduled to travel to Melun in the north of France. It was a Z5300 electric multiple unit, a motor car at the front with 3 passenger cars behind. The Z5300s had 2 braking systems, a standard air brake and an electric brake that reversed the motors into generators. But drivers often avoided the electric brake. When used alongside the air brake, it could cause the wheels to lock and skid, leaving flat spots that meant the train had to be taken out of service for repairs. The other train involved was regional service number 153,944, running the opposite route, from Melun to Paris. On that day, it was made up of 2 4-car Z5300 units coupled together, weighing a total of over 300 tons. Just before the accident, the French National Railway, SNCF, had introduced a new summer timetable. For this service, the trip between Melun and Paris was shortened by skipping several low-demand stations. It was a small change on paper, but it would play a key role in what was about to unfold. On June 27, 1988, at around 6 p.m., regional train 153,944 was on its final stretch toward Paris Gare de Lyon. By 6:35, it passed through Le Ver de Maison, a station it used to stop at, until a new timetable removed it from the schedule. As the platform slipped by, a passenger suddenly pulled the emergency brake. The train came to a halt. Without waiting for staff, the passenger stepped off and left the station. Determined to get moving quickly, the driver left his cab and walked to the rear of the lead car to reset the brakes. The reset lever was stuck, so he grabbed a nearby handle for leverage. The brakes released, but in doing so, he had unknowingly moved the second handle. This small movement closed the main valve, cutting the brake connection between the motor car and the 7 trailing cars. From that moment on, only the lead unit had working brakes, and no one realized it. When the driver noticed the brakes on the rear cars were still applied, he didn't wait for a technician. He assumed the emergency stop had simply built up too much pressure in the system, something that occasionally happened, and decided to fix it himself. Moving quickly, he ran along one side of the train, releasing air from each wheel set, while the conductor did the same on the other side. But with the main valve unknowingly closed, there was no way to restore air to the system. The brakes on most of the train were now not just weak, they didn't work at all. By now, many passengers had left to find other ways to reach their destinations. Almost 30 minutes behind schedule, the train finally set off again. Dispatch instructed the driver to skip the final stop before Gare de Lyon to make up some time. That last station, Maison Alfort, sat on level ground, and stopping there could have revealed the problem with the brakes. The driver might have simply coasted to a halt and avoided disaster. But with the stop removed from his orders, he would head straight toward the steep downhill ramp into Gare de Lyon, completely unaware that his train was now a runaway. At the same time, regional train 153951, bound for Melun, was waiting on track 2 in the underground platforms of Gare de Lyon. Its scheduled departure time of 7:04 p.m. had already passed. The conductor hadn't shown up, and the delay dragged on. The lead car was stopped right beside the station's main staircase, so most passengers had filled the seats in the front before gradually spilling into the rest of the train. In the driver's cab sat Mr. Tanguy. He kept an eye on the clock, growing impatient as the minutes ticked by, unaware that a fully loaded runaway train was already on its way down the ramp toward him. On the inbound train, the driver kept an eye on the manometer in his cab. It showed normal air pressure, but it was only reading the brakes on the lead car. He had no way of knowing that the rest of the train's brakes were useless. Less than 2 kilometers from Gare de Lyon, the train passed a signal ordering him to slow down. He applied the brakes, and only then realized something was terribly wrong. The train slowed from 96 to just 45 kilometers per hour before it reached the start of the downhill ramp. Gravity quickly overpowered the braking force of the lead car. The train began to accelerate. At 7:07 p.m., the driver called Gare de Lyon's control center with a chilling message. He had no working brakes. Moments later, the control room triggered the station's general alarm. A high-pitched alarm echoed through the cabs of every train in the area. Signals across a 10-kilometer radius turned red, halting all traffic in and out of one of France's busiest stations. But there was a fatal flaw. The alarm also froze the track switches in their current positions. This safety measure was meant to give the control center full manual control, yet now it locked Mr. Tanguy's train directly in the path of the oncoming runaway. Making matters worse, the driver of the runaway train hadn't identified himself when he radioed in, leaving controllers unsure exactly which train was out of control. He also hadn't used the electric brake system, an option that, while imperfect, could have slowed him further. Realizing the danger, the driver abandoned the cab and rushed through the cars, urging passengers to move to the rear. He knew that when over 150 tons of steel hit another train at speed, survival would depend on being as far from the point of impact as possible. But leaving the cab also meant the control center had no way to reach him for updates, and the clock was running out. In his cab, Mr. Tanguy had just watched his conductor finally step aboard when the alarm began to scream. Seconds later, his signal turned red, stopping him from leaving the station. He had no idea what was happening, and with the radio system tied up by the alarm, he couldn't contact the control center for answers. It was only in the final minute before impact that controllers realized which train the earlier radio call had come from, and where it was headed. The collision was now unavoidable. Over the station's intercom, they ordered everyone to evacuate the underground platforms. Hearing this, Mr. Tanguy picked up his own microphone and began telling his passengers to get out, repeating the warning again and again. He could have run, but chose to stay at his post, guiding people to safety, even as the runaway train thundered toward him. At 7:09 p.m., runaway train 153944 slammed head-on into the stationary train at more than 70 kilometers per hour. The impact was devastating. The lead car of the waiting train was instantly obliterated, crushed back against the rear wall of the station. In seconds, 30 meters of train were compacted into twisted metal. Trapped in a tunnel with a solid platform and a dead end, there was nowhere for the force to escape. Every bit of energy from the collision tore through the trains and their passengers. Only 2 people on the stationary train survived. In total, 56 lives were lost, and 57 others were injured. Mr. Tanguy, who stayed at his post to warn his passengers, died in the crash. The driver of the runaway train, however, survived, having moved toward the rear, along with many of those he tried to protect. The first professional responders arrived at 7:20 p.m. just 11 minutes after the crash. But even in those first moments, the station was already filled with civilians doing whatever they could to help. The scene was overwhelming. The air was heavy with dust, the sharp smell of hot metal, and the cries of the injured. Passengers in the rear of the runaway train escaped with mostly minor injuries. But for those still trapped in the stationary train, the situation was far more grim. Many were pinned in mangled steel. Firefighters and medics worked frantically, cutting survivors free. For some, escape meant the unthinkable, leaving parts of themselves behind. No one yet understood what had happened. How could two trains collide like this, in the heart of Paris, with such force? The nation's mind went to its darkest fears. France had suffered a wave of terrorist attacks in recent years, including a deadly bomb on a TGV high-speed train in 1983, and another on an express train the year before. Witnesses recalled seeing a woman pull the emergency brake and then walk away moments before disaster struck. Whispers spread quickly. Had she stopped the train deliberately, part of a larger plan to sabotage the brakes while everyone was distracted? The sabotage theory gained traction when investigators examined the wreckage and found the main brake valve on the runaway train closed. Without that valve open, most of the train's brakes would have been useless. The driver insisted he had only reset the emergency brakes after the stop and swore he had never touched the main valve. Days later, a Paris newspaper ran a bold, full-page plea, asking the person who had triggered the emergency stop to come forward. The appeal worked. A 21-year-old single mother walked into a police station and admitted it was her. She explained that she often used the train to collect her children from a school near Le Ver de Maison, unaware the stop had been removed from the timetable. Panicked at the thought of her children waiting alone, she pulled the emergency brake, then left the train immediately, hurrying to meet them. With sabotage ruled out, investigators turned their focus back to the driver. On the ZEED 5300 trains, the brake reset handle sat at the rear of the leading car, awkwardly far from the edges and not easy to reach. During reenactments, investigators discovered that operating it required significant force, especially since this handle hadn't been used in some time. Under the pressure of running late, the driver may have braced himself without looking, grabbing whatever was within reach for leverage. In doing so, it's possible his hand closed on the main brake valve and unknowingly shut it. From that moment, most of the train's brakes were disabled, and with the system's gauges only showing pressure in the leading car, there was no way for him to tell the difference between too much pressure and no pressure at all. But the investigation also uncovered a chain of human errors. By manually bleeding the air from the rear 7 cars, and in doing so overriding a built-in safety system that prevents brake release when the main valve is closed, the driver had broken company protocol. His next mistake came during the emergency call. In the heat of the moment, he failed to mention his train number. That single omission robbed the control center of the chance to divert his nearly empty train onto a vacant track, where the worst-case outcome would likely have been a violent but survivable impact with a buffer stop. And finally, in the chaos, he forgot about his train's electric brake, a system that could have shed precious speed before impact. In the control center, the clock was ticking. They had just 2 minutes from the first alarm to the moment of impact. If they'd known which train had sent the distress call, they could have thrown the points, steering it onto an empty track. Some would later argue they should have done it anyway, as a precaution, the moment the alarm sounded. But the chain of errors didn't end there. Investigators also pointed to the stationary train's conductor. His late arrival had kept the train at the platform far longer than planned, and packed its forward cars with passengers. That small delay, a matter of minutes, had helped set the stage for the tragedy that followed. In the months that followed, France's National Railway, the SNCF, moved quickly to make sure such a disaster could never happen again. An emergency brake override system was added to the fleet. Now, if a passenger pulled the handle, the train wouldn't stop on the spot. Instead, the driver would receive an urgent alert, giving them control over when and how to brake. At Gare de Lyon's underground platforms, repairs were paired with new high-capacity buffer stops designed to swallow more impact energy than ever before. The driver of the runaway train was initially sentenced to 4 years in prison for negligent manslaughter. The conductor of the stationary train received 6 months on probation. The passenger who had pulled the emergency brake was fined, as was a control center worker, punished for failing to route the runaway into a free track. The verdict sparked outrage within the SNCF. Workers went on strike, insisting their colleague had been turned into a scapegoat for outdated technology and an unforgiving timetable. In a retrial, the driver's sentence was reduced to just 6 months in jail, with the rest converted to probation. The conductor was cleared of all guilt. The 1988 Gare de Lyon train collision was not just a chain of human errors. It was a mirror held up to a system under pressure. Tight schedules, outdated technology, miscommunication, and split-second decisions turned an ordinary evening into one of France's deadliest rail disasters. But here's the question that still divides people more than 3 decades later. Was this truly the fault of one man in the cab? Or was it the inevitable result of a system destined to fail? I'd like to hear what you think. Was justice served? And could this disaster have been prevented long before that night?